Good morning. I want to begin by acknowledging the gravity of the moment in which we find ourselves, a moment defined not by a single transaction or bilateral agreement, but by a broader realignment of economic relationships that has been unfolding with increasing velocity over the past several years. The announcement of a $47 billion energy transaction between Canada and international partners, one that notably does not route through the traditional channels of United States regulatory or diplomatic approval, is not, as some commentators have suggested, a sudden rupture. It is rather the visible manifestation of forces that have been building beneath the surface of the global economic order for some time now, and it is our responsibility as stewards of fiscal and monetary policy to understand those forces clearly, to contextualize them accurately, and to respond to them with the sober judgment that the American people and our global partners deserve. Let me begin with what we know. Canada remains one of the United States' most significant trading partners. The relationship between our two economies is deeply interwoven through supply chains, through energy infrastructure, through labor markets, and through decades of diplomatic and institutional cooperation, formalized under agreements that have evolved from the original free trade agreement through NAFTA and into the current framework of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Any significant economic decision made in Ottawa carries implications for industries and workers across the American Midwest, the energy-producing states of the South and Mountain West, and the financial markets that price risk and capital allocation across the entire North American continent. To dismiss the significance of this transaction, or to minimize its implications for the United States economy, would be an analytical error of the first order. At the same time, we must resist the temptation to catastrophize. The characterization of this development as evidence of an imminent American economic collapse in 2026 is not supported by the data available to us, and it does a disservice to the complexity of the situation to frame it in those terms. What this moment does represent is a test of the resilience of American economic institutions, a test of the credibility of our trade and energy policy frameworks, and ultimately a test of whether the United States can adapt its strategic posture in a rapidly changing global environment without sacrificing the foundational strengths that have made this economy the largest and most dynamic in the world for generations. To understand why Canada has made this decision, we need to understand the broader context of North American energy markets and the geopolitical pressures that have reshaped them. Canada is the fourth largest oil producer in the world. Its oil sands in Alberta represent one of the largest proven petroleum reserves on the planet. For decades, the primary market for Canadian crude was, by geography and infrastructure, the United States. The pipeline networks that crisscross the border, running into refineries in the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast, made the United States not just the preferred buyer of Canadian energy, but in many respects the only practical buyer at scale. That structural dependency, however, created vulnerabilities that Canadian policymakers have been working systematically to reduce. The repeated policy uncertainty around major pipeline projects, the shifts in American regulatory philosophy across successive administrations, and the growing recognition in Ottawa that over-reliance on a single export market creates both economic and political risk. All of these factors have pushed Canada toward a strategy of market diversification that was always logical and has now become, from their perspective, urgent. The $47 billion figure associated with this transaction is significant not merely because of its scale, though its scale is indeed substantial, but because of what it signals about the directionality of Canadian energy policy going forward. This is not a one-time arbitrage play designed to capture a favorable price differential. This is a structural repositioning. When a sovereign nation or a consortium of state-affiliated and private energy entities commits capital at that level to an alternative distribution and export framework, they are making a statement about their long-term expectations regarding market access, price stability, and the reliability of their economic partnerships. Canada is telling the world and telling Washington that it intends to be a global energy supplier, not merely a continental one. That is a rational decision. It is also one that has meaningful consequences for the United States, and those consequences deserve careful, dispassionate analysis. From a macroeconomic standpoint, the immediate impact on the United States economy will depend heavily on the specifics of the transaction, which markets the Canadian crude will now be directed toward, on what timeline, through what infrastructure, and under what pricing arrangements. If Canadian oil that previously flowed to American refineries is redirected to Asian markets, to buyers in China, Japan, South Korea, or India, the effect on American refinery input costs will depend on whether alternative supplies can be sourced at comparable prices. The global oil market is, in principle, a fungible market. A barrel of oil diverted from a Gulf Coast refinery to a terminal in British Columbia destined for Shanghai is, in theory, replaced by a barrel from the Middle East, from West Africa, or from increased domestic production. In practice, however, the transportation economics, the quality differentials between crude types, and the existing contractual frameworks governing refinery operations mean that substitution is rarely as seamless as the theoretical model suggests. This is precisely the kind of structural adjustment that demands active engagement from both the Treasury Department and the Department of Energy, in close coordination with our trade representatives and our diplomatic corps. The question is not whether the American energy sector can adapt. It can, and it will. American domestic production has shown remarkable resilience and flexibility, and the shale revolution of the past 2 decades has fundamentally altered the supply-side dynamics of the North American energy market in ways that provide meaningful buffer against external supply shocks. The question is whether we can manage the transition in a way that minimizes disruption to industries and workers who depend on stable input costs, and whether we can use this moment as a catalyst for the kind of long-term strategic thinking about energy security and trade relationships that our policy framework has sometimes lacked. I want to be direct about something that I think often gets lost in the political commentary surrounding events like this one. Economic relationships between nations are not zero-sum arrangements in which one country's gain necessarily constitutes another's loss. The notion that Canada bypassing the White House, a characterization I would note is more rhetorical than analytically precise, represents some kind of defeat for American economic interests, misunderstands the nature of how sovereign economies interact in a market-based global system. Canada is not required to seek American approval for its commercial energy decisions, just as the United States is not required to seek Canadian approval when American energy companies enter into long-term supply contracts with European or Asian buyers. The fact that this transaction has been framed in adversarial terms is itself a symptom of a broader deterioration in the diplomatic and economic relationship between the two countries, a deterioration that serves neither nation's long-term interests and that I believe can and must be reversed. The path forward requires, first and foremost, an honest accounting of how we arrived at this juncture. Sustained policy uncertainty, the kind that manifests in repeated reversals on major infrastructure decisions, unpredictable tariff regimes, and a rhetorical posture toward trading partners that oscillates between partnership and confrontation, has real economic costs. Those costs are not always immediately visible in the headline data. They do not always show up in the next quarterly GDP release or the monthly employment figures, but they accumulate in the form of investment decisions deferred, trade relationships recalibrated, and strategic partnerships quietly but deliberately reoriented. What we are witnessing today with this transaction is the downstream consequence of a period of policy instability whose costs we are only now beginning to fully reckon with. Let us turn now to the question that I suspect is foremost in the minds of many Americans who are following this situation closely, the question of what this development means for the United States economy in 2026 and beyond, and whether the concerns being raised about economic vulnerability are grounded in analytical reality or whether they represent, at least in part, an amplification of risk that exceeds what the underlying data actually supports. I want to engage with this question seriously because I think the American public deserves a serious answer, and because the consequences of either understating or overstating economic risk are both significant in ways that are sometimes not fully appreciated in public discourse. Let me begin with where the American economy actually stands as we move through this period. The United States economy has demonstrated considerable resilience in the face of a sequence of shocks that, taken together, would have severely destabilized less fundamentally sound economic systems. We navigated the most significant pandemic related economic disruption in a century. We managed, through a combination of monetary policy tightening and careful fiscal calibration, to bring inflation down from levels that represented the most acute price stability challenge in 4 decades without triggering the kind of severe recessionary contraction that many analysts feared was the necessary cost of that disinflation. The labor market, which I have long believed is one of the most reliable indicators of underlying economic health, has shown a degree of robustness that has repeatedly exceeded the expectations embedded in consensus forecasts. Unemployment has remained at historically low levels. Labor force participation among prime age workers has recovered to rates not seen in 2 decades. Real wages, after a period in which nominal gains were eroded by elevated inflation, have returned to positive territory for workers across the income distribution. These are not trivial accomplishments. They reflect the fundamental productive capacity of the American economy, the depth and breadth of its labor markets, the dynamism of its private sector, the strength of its institutional frameworks, and the credibility of its policy institutions. None of that has changed as a result of the Canadian energy transaction we are discussing. None of it will change overnight because of a single bilateral commercial decision, however significant that decision may be in strategic terms. The foundation of the American economy is not so fragile that it can be undermined by the energy policy choices of even our most important trading partners. And I say this not to minimize the significance of those choices, but to provide the appropriate context within which they must be evaluated. That said, I do not want to be dismissive of the genuine vulnerabilities that this moment illuminates. The American economy faces a set of structural challenges in 2026 that require clear-eyed acknowledgement and sustained policy attention. The federal fiscal position, the relationship between government revenues and expenditures, and the trajectory of the national debt presents challenges that are real and that will require difficult choices in the years ahead. The cost of servicing the national debt has risen significantly as interest rates normalized from the historically low levels that prevailed during and immediately after the pandemic period. The demographic pressures on entitlement programs, on Social Security, on Medicare, on Medicaid are not new, but they are intensifying as the baby boom generation moves fully into retirement age. These are not crises that will announce themselves with a single dramatic event. They are slow-moving fiscal pressures that compound over time and that become progressively more difficult and more costly to address the longer they are deferred. At the same time, the external economic environment in which the United States operates has become materially more complex and in some respects more challenging than it was even 5 years ago. The global economy is undergoing a structural transformation driven by three intersecting forces: the energy transition away from fossil fuels and toward renewable and low-carbon sources of energy, the technological transformation associated with artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, and the digitalization of economic activity, and the geopolitical realignment that has seen the rules-based international economic order under increasing stress from both great power competition and the domestic political pressures building within many of the democracies that built and sustained that order over the past 8 decades. Each of these forces creates both risks and opportunities for the United States. How we navigate that combination will determine, to a very significant degree, the trajectory of American economic prosperity over the next generation. The Canadian energy decision must be understood within this larger frame. Canada is not simply making a commercial decision about where to sell its oil. It is making a strategic decision about its place in a global economy that is being reorganized around new axes of influence, new supply chain architectures, and new energy infrastructure networks. The countries and regions that are moving most deliberately to position themselves within these emerging frameworks through investment in port infrastructure, in liquefied natural gas export capacity, in renewable energy production, in critical mineral supply chains, are those that will exercise the most economic leverage in the decades ahead. Canada, with its extraordinary endowment of natural resources, its skilled workforce, its stable institutional environment, and its geographic position bridging the Atlantic and Pacific economies, is well positioned to play a significant role in that reorganized global economy. The question for the United States is whether we will be Canada's primary partner in that endeavor, or whether we will find ourselves, through policy inaction or strategic incoherence, gradually marginalized from a relationship that has historically been one of our most economically consequential. I want to address directly the claim, which has been circulating with some frequency in certain media and political commentary, that the United States faces an economic collapse in 2026. I use the word collapse deliberately because that is the word that is being used, and I think it is important to be precise about what that word means and whether it is an appropriate description of the risks we actually face. An economic collapse, in the technical sense in which economists use that term, refers to a sudden, severe, and disorderly contraction of economic activity, typically accompanied by financial system dysfunction, widespread unemployment, a breakdown in credit markets, and a loss of confidence in economic institutions that becomes self-reinforcing. The United States economy does not face those conditions. That assessment is not a matter of political optimism. It is a matter of looking at the data, at the health of the banking system, at the depth and liquidity of our capital markets, at the fundamental productivity of the American workforce, at the global demand for dollar-denominated assets, and making an honest judgment about what those data tell us. What the United States does face, and what I think it is important to be honest about, is a period of meaningful economic adjustment. Adjustment is not collapse. Adjustment is the process by which an economy recalibrates its productive activities, its trade relationships, its investment patterns, and its policy frameworks in response to changes in the external environment and in the underlying structure of economic activity. Adjustment can be managed well or managed poorly. It can be accompanied by targeted policy interventions that cushion the impact on the most vulnerable workers and communities, or it can be allowed to proceed in an unmanaged way that concentrates the costs of transition on those least equipped to absorb them. The difference between those two outcomes is not determined by market forces alone. It is determined in very significant part by the quality of economic governance, by the wisdom, the coherence, and the long-term orientation of fiscal, monetary, and trade policy. This brings me to the specific policy responses that I believe are warranted in light of the current situation. The first and most immediate priority is to stabilize and clarify the United States trade and energy policy framework. Policy uncertainty is itself an economic cost. When businesses, whether they are American energy companies evaluating investment in domestic production capacity or Canadian energy firms weighing the relative attractiveness of the American market versus alternatives, or Asian investors considering where to deploy capital in North American energy infrastructure, cannot form reliable expectations about the regulatory and tariff environment they will face, they defer investment, reduce exposure, and seek alternatives. The aggregate effect of that behavioral response, multiplied across thousands of investment decisions, is a measurable drag on economic growth. Restoring policy predictability is not a soft or secondary concern. It is a hard economic imperative with direct implications for growth, employment, and competitiveness. The second priority is to re-engage with Canada and with our other major trading partners on the basis of mutual economic interest and long-term strategic partnership. The diplomatic and economic relationship between the United States and Canada is too important, too deeply embedded in the structure of both economies, and too consequential for the broader North American economic framework to be allowed to deteriorate further. The $47 billion transaction we have been discussing is, among other things, a signal that Canada is prepared to act on its strategic interests independently if the United States does not demonstrate a credible commitment to being a reliable and respectful partner. Receiving that signal with the seriousness it deserves and responding to it through sustained diplomatic and economic engagement rather than rhetorical escalation is both the strategically sound and the economically rational course of action. The third priority, and this is one that I feel particularly strongly about because it speaks to the long term competitive position of the United States in the global economy, is to accelerate domestic investment in the infrastructure, technology, and human capital that will determine American economic leadership in the decades ahead. The energy transition is real. It is proceeding, albeit unevenly, across every major economy in the world. The countries that invest now in clean energy production, in grid modernization, in advanced manufacturing capacity, and in the workforce development programs needed to ensure that American workers can participate fully in the economy of the future will be the countries that exercise the most economic influence in the second half of the 21st century. The United States has the resources, the institutional capacity, and the innovative dynamism to lead that transition. Whether we choose to do so, whether we make the policy commitments and the public investments that leadership requires, is a choice that this generation of policymakers must make with full awareness of its long term consequences. There is a dimension of this discussion that I have not yet addressed directly, and that I think deserves sustained and careful attention: the dimension of global financial markets and the role that confidence in American economic institutions plays in maintaining the stability of the international monetary system. This is not an abstract or academic concern. It is a practical matter with immediate consequences for the cost of borrowing, for the value of the dollar, for the accessibility of credit to American businesses and households, and for the capacity of the United States government to finance its obligations at rates that do not crowd out the public investments we need to make in infrastructure, education, research, and the social programs that support the well-being of American families. Understanding the connection between the geopolitical and trade developments we have been discussing and the functioning of global financial markets is essential to forming an accurate picture of the economic environment we are navigating. The United States dollar occupies a unique and consequential position in the global financial system. As the world's primary reserve currency, the currency in which the majority of international trade is invoiced, in which the majority of foreign exchange reserves are held, and in which the deepest and most liquid financial markets in the world are denominated, the dollar confers on the United States what the French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously described as an exorbitant privilege. That privilege manifests in concrete economic terms. It means that the United States can borrow at lower interest rates than it otherwise could, that it can run persistent current account deficits without facing the kind of balance of payments crises that have destabilized other economies, and that American financial institutions occupy a central role in the global intermediation of capital that generates significant economic rents. The maintenance of that privilege is not guaranteed. It is contingent on the continued willingness of the rest of the world to hold dollar-denominated assets, which is in turn contingent on confidence in the stability, the rule of law, the institutional integrity, and the long-term fiscal sustainability of the American economy.